I said, my name is all I ever gave her, and she made it feel safe. Lena smiled and said, I love how hard you work for us, it makes me feel secure. I replied, I do it because I want our future to be bright and simple. She touched my hand and whispered, you trust me, right, even with your money? I laughed and said, of course you're my fiancé, my heart is already yours. Ethan pulled me aside and said, she keeps asking about your accounts, that feels wrong. I shrugged and said, you're just being careful, love doesn't keep score. Maya added, I see how she watches your phone when you check your bank. I said, she's just excited about planning our life together. Lena walked over and said, one day you'll buy me something that proves you really love me. I smiled proudly and said, I'll get you that mansion you keep dreaming about. She laughed softly and said, I knew you'd say that, you always give me everything. Later I checked my phone and whispered, why does my balance say 0? My hands shook as I said, this has to be a mistake. I called Lena and said, please answer, I need to hear your voice. The line stayed silent and I said, don't do this to me. I tried again and said, we were just talking about our future. My chest felt tight as I said, something terrible just happened. I stared at the screen and said, where did all my money go? The ringing stopped and I whispered, Lena, please come back to me. I said, Lena, tell me this isn't real, tell me my money is still ours. Lena crossed her arms and said, I used it and I don't regret it. I stared at Ryan and said, why are you standing beside her in this house? Ryan smirked and said, because she chose me and your money. I whispered, we were going to get married, we promised each other everything. Lena laughed and said, you were only good for paying my bills. I felt my heart break as I said, I gave you my trust, not just my bank. She said, trust doesn't buy mansions, your money does. Mrs. Hale walked in and said, the deal is done, stop making a scene. I looked at her and said, you're okay stealing from me like this? She replied, business is business, don't be dramatic. Ryan said, you were a wallet pretending to be a man. I shouted, I loved her, I wasn't pretending. Lena said, love is useless when you're poor. I felt tears as I said, please just tell me you cared at least once. She shrugged and said, you were convenient. I turned away and said, I hope you choke on everything you took. Rain soaked me as I said, I have nothing left now. I drank and whispered, I gave her everything I was. Headlights blinded me as I said, I just wanted to be loved. A voice asked, do you want another chance? I whispered, yes, give me one more life. I gasped and said, I'm alive again, this feels like a bad dream. A calm voice said, I am your system and I brought you back before everything was taken. I whispered, you know about Lena and the money, don't you? The voice replied, I know every future she planned to steal from you. I clenched my fists and said, then tell me how to stop her. The system said, I will guide you but the choices will still be yours. I checked my phone and said, this date is years before she ruined me. I breathed hard and said, I can change everything now. I met Lena later and said, I still love you, you know that. She smiled and said, of course you always take care of me. I nodded and said, I always will, just like you expect. Inside I thought, I will never let you touch my money again. I transferred my savings and said, my future is finally in my control. I called Maya and said, I need you, I can't do this alone. She said, I'm here, tell me what's wrong. I replied, I was betrayed and I won't be fooled again. I met Ethan and said, I need your help this time. He said, I warned you before but I won't abandon you now. I found Mr. Cross and said, I want someone destroyed legally. He said, I can do that if you're serious. I answered, I'm done being kind to people who hurt me. The system whispered, this path will be dark. I said, I don't care anymore. I choose to fight. I smiled at Lena and said, I sent you more money just like you asked. She laughed and said, good, you always know how to please me. I replied, anything for you, I want you to have everything. Inside I whispered, every dollar you take makes your fall closer. I called Daniel and said, I can pay you more if you slow her deal. He answered, money talks, just tell me what you want. I said, make sure she never fully owns that mansion. I visited Mrs. Hale and said, your contracts have problems and I can expose them. She snapped, you're bluffing, you don't have that power. I smiled and said, I have lawyers and patience. Ryan called me and said, why is everything getting delayed? I replied, maybe the universe is tired of helping you. Lena texted me and said, I need more money now, don't be slow. I wrote back, anything for you, I'm on it. Maya warned me and said, "This revenge is changing you." I said, "I already lost my heart the day she betrayed me." She whispered, "Just don't lose your soul too." I answered, "I'm not sure I have one left." I watched the mansion papers and said, "Every signature belongs to me now." The system said, "Your trap is almost complete." I replied, "Let it close." Lena called again and said, "Hurry up, I deserve more." I smiled and said, "You'll get exactly what you deserve." I walked into the auction hall and said, "I'm here to place my final bid." Lena smiled and said, "Don't worry, you already sent me the money." I looked at her and said, "Yes, I sent it exactly where I wanted." Mr. Cross stood up and said, "The winning buyer is this gentleman right here." I said, "That gentleman is me." Lena gasped and said, "What are you talking about? This is my deal." Ryan shouted, "You can't do this, you're just her fiancé." I replied, "I'm the owner of every account you used." Mrs. Hale said, "That can't be true, I signed with Lena." I answered, "You signed with money that belongs to me." Lena whispered, "You promised me everything." I said, "I promised love, not to be robbed." Ryan yelled, "You're ruining our future." I said, "You already ruined mine." Lena dropped to her knees and said, "Please don't take this from me." I felt my chest steady as I said, "You already took everything from me." Mrs. Hale cried, "I'll lose my house." I replied, "That's how debt works." Lena said, "I'll do anything you want." I answered, "I don't want you anymore." The system whispered, "Power has shifted." I said, "I can feel it." Lena looked up and said, "I'm nothing without you." I replied, "Now you finally understand how I felt." I watched Lena stumble toward me and said, "You don't look so powerful anymore." She cried and said, "Ryan left me, he took what little I had." I answered, "That's what happens when you build love on money." She grabbed my arm and said, "I made a mistake, please forgive me." I pulled back and said, "You already spent your chances." Mrs. Hale shouted and said, "Don't come back, you ruined everything." I whispered, "Even your family is done with you now." Lena said, "I only wanted to feel safe." I replied, "I gave you safety and you sold it." Maya stood beside me and said, "You don't need to hurt him anymore." I nodded and said, "I'm not hurting, I'm just done." Lena fell to the floor and said, "I'll do anything, just don't leave me." I said, "You left me first." She cried and said, "I still love you." I answered, "You loved my money." Ryan ran past and shouted, "I'm not going down with you." I said, "That's the man you chose." Lena looked at me and said, "Where do I go now?" I replied, "Anywhere that isn't my life." She whispered, "You're cruel now." I said, "No, I'm finally honest." Maya squeezed my hand and said, "Let her go." I nodded and said, "Goodbye, Lena." She walked away and I said, "I feel free." I said, "Maya, I want to build something real with you, not something made from pain." She smiled and said, "You already did by surviving everything they did to you." I replied, "I used to think revenge would fix my heart, but it only made it heavy." She said, "Justice gave you peace, not hatred." I nodded and said, "I finally wake up without seeing her face in my mind." Ethan called me and said, "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." I answered, "I'm proud that I didn't become the man she wanted me to be." Maya said, "Our new business is doing well and it feels clean." I smiled and said, "For once, my money feels honest." She laughed and said, "So does your heart." I walked through my quiet home and said, "I don't hear her voice anymore." Maya replied, "That's because you let it go." I whispered, "I thought losing her would destroy me." She said, "It rebuilt you instead." I looked at the city lights and said, "I don't feel angry now." Maya said, "You feel free." I answered, "I feel like I finally belong to myself." Ethan added, "That's what real power looks like." I said, "Lena is just a memory now, not a wound." Maya held my hand and said, "You earned this peace." I took a breath and said, "I didn't win by destroying her." I smiled softly and said, "I won by choosing myself." I walk forward today knowing my future is mine, and every step feels lighter because I finally trust myself again and one more peaceful tomorrow.